You are watching CCG Global Dialogue, 50 Years of US-China Exchange in Retrospect, The Bush Legacy and Beyond, featuring Mr. Neil Bush and Mr. David Firestein, founder and chairman, president, CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China Relations. This program is presented to you by the Center for China and Globalization and hosted by CCG President, Dr. Wang Huiyao. Dr. Wang.
Thank you. Good evening and also good morning. This is Wang Huiyao, the founder and the president of Center for China and Globalization that hosted this dialogue from CCG head office in Beijing. And so we are really pleased to welcome all of you to tune in for this CCG China and the World special dialogue series. And it's live from Beijing. Thank you for joining us today, actually. And so this is actually the 12th episode, and we are very honored and pleased to have two distinguished guests from George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China Relations today. The Bush-China Foundation was founded in May 2017 by Neil Bush with blessing and support of President George W. Bush, and began full operations on September 2019. So this actually special dialogue event was actually as the background of the 50 years anniversary of course, Dr. Kissinger's visit to China, but also started the 50 years of exchanges with China and between China and the US, United States. But this year is also the 50 years of China joining United Nations. I remember George H.W. Bush was actually America's UN ambassador in 1971. That's when China joined the United Nations. So it's a great, it's not a coincidence, you know, China has started a different, this kind of exchange with US 50 years ago. Now also it's the year of China joined the United Nations. Dr. Kissinger visited China in July, and China joined the United Nations in October in 1971, actually 50 years ago, half a century. So we know that for both President George H.W. Bush and of course also George W. Bush, I mean, it's very, very probably break the history for the Bush family has two presidents of the United States. It's something that we are very, very honored to have the Bush Foundation that actually talking to us, to our audience in China today. Also, with this background, I want to mention that for the George H.W. Bush, I mean, he actually was the U.S. envoy, and also maybe you can call a bicycle ambassador to China during the U.S. liaison office in Beijing between 1974 and 1975. And so that is really historical for probably the first ambassador status representative of U.S. to China as early as 1974 to 75. So Neil Bush, I mean, the founder of the Bush Foundation, you were also in China at that time, made a lot of visit then. So it's very, very pleased to see that we are actually talking about tonight about the Bush legacy and also the implications for China-U.S. relations, and also in retrospect, half a century, but also looking forward for another future prospect of China-U.S. relations. But also, I'd like to say that the George H.W. Bush actually being the first liaison office ambassador to China, but also he was the president in 1989, and after 1 month in office, paid a visit to China, the soonest which took the office to visit China. And his son, George W. Bush, I mean, also Neil Bush's brother, had made a full visit to China. And so that's really impressive, including the 208 Olympic game that both both Bush president actually visit China. So it's such a rememberable past of all the good relations we have. So, so I think that actually President George H.W. Bush actually said, we value the new relationship of our two countries, and also we have established with each other. We remain firmly committed to the principles set forth in those three joint communiques that form the basis of relationship. And actually, President George W. Bush even said in his China diary in 2007, I love the Chinese people, President Bush wrote. One of my dreams for our world is that those two powerful giants will continue working towards full partnership and friendship that will bring peace and prosperity to the people everywhere. So we are actually celebrating this great legacy, and so this is really a great moment to look at that. So what I'd like to introduce the two very distinguished guests actually joining us tonight is first is Neil Bush. Neil Bush is the founder and the chair of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China relations. He's the third of the 5 children of President and Mrs. George H.W. Bush. So Mr. Bush has actually been involved with energy, real estate, and international business development for the 4 decades, beginning in 1980. But for the past 25 years, Mr. Bush has engaged in various international business development activities with a focus on China. He first visited China in 1975 when his father was the chief liaison officer representing the United States in Beijing. His business and personal interests have allowed for many return trips over the years. Since 1975, Mr. Bush has traveled to China over 140 times and has visited over 40 cities in China. So it's a remarkable record. I think probably only Kissinger maybe has made that many trips. Probably you have made more than that. But also I'd like to introduce another distinguished guest tonight is David Firestein. He's actually the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China relations, or you can call Bush-China Foundation, and also a founding and current member of the foundation board of directors. And prior to joining the Bush-China Foundation, Mr. Firestein was the founding executive director of the University of Texas, Austin, China Public Policy Center. And also he's a professor at the University's London B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Of course, before moving to University of Texas, Mr. Firestein served as a senior vice president and payroll fellow of the New York City-based East-West Institute, where he led the Institute's track to diplomacy dialogue. So very experienced, seasoned, also diplomat, decorated career of US diplomat from 1992 to 2010. Mr. Firestein specialized primarily in the US-China relations. So a very old friend of China, also very senior China hand. And of course, I remember we hosted you in 2012 when CCG hosted you there at the Western Return Scholar Association. You were giving an analysis of the US election, presidential election in 2012. So it's quite almost a decade ago. Now we see tremendous changes. So I would like to start the dialogue tonight with Bush Foundation and also the senior representative of Bush Foundation. So President George H.W. Bush was the pioneer in the US-China diplomacy. He was the US chief diplomatic envoy in China during the 1974-75, which was before US and China formally established diplomatic ties. So Neil, you first, I remember you said somewhere, you first visited China in 1975, and of course continued travel to China on a regular basis since then. So given you have made to China and traveled to China 100 sometimes, so you have witnessed actually firsthand in the last 4 or 5 decades of the tremendous changes that China has made. So maybe you can give your first assessment of what you see the relationship.
First of all, Henry, thank you so much for having us on your show as part of the dialogue. You do such wonderful work, bringing ideas out and helping to inform the public. I think I'll start by reflecting back on October of 1971. You mentioned that the Chinese were admitted, or China was admitted to the UN. I happened to be in New York City during that vote. My dad worked tirelessly promoting the two China representation concept. That was the position of the US government at the time. They got voted down and China was admitted. Taiwan was kicked out. The first thing my dad did when the Chinese delegation arrived into the United States was invite them to a lunch at my grandmother's home in Connecticut to show kind of American hospitality, to welcome them with open arms. And from that point on, his first real contact with Chinese leaders, my dad has, as you pointed out in the letter you referred to, has had an affection for the Chinese people and has high aspirations for how our two great countries should be working together. Yes, I was there in 1975. My three of my siblings and I visited for 5 weeks. We were in Beijing for 4 weeks and then traveled with my mother by train to Wuxi, Nanjing, and Shanghai. And it has been a remarkable thing to sit on the sidelines and to witness this incredible growth that China has experienced over the past 46 years when I was first there. The China I saw in 1975, and I don't want to be offensive to anyone, but was basically freedomless. Everyone was equal. They were equally poor. And that people were friendly towards us. We rode our bikes all over the place, and we were treated very kindly. But there was propaganda machines everywhere. Everywhere you go, the word was being spouted out. People were still being sent, as the end of the Cultural Revolution, being sent to the countryside, and people couldn't make daily choices that clearly they can make today. And so, looking back 46 years later, if I were back in 1975, I couldn't have predicted or imagined that China would have had hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, that the middle class would be growing as rapidly as it is, that the economy continues to churn out new jobs and crank out wealth for people, that people would enjoy daily freedoms that frankly back then were clearly unimaginable, happening in China. So I've been deeply impressed by this, Henry. I'll be honest with you. And I think one of the things that separates me from other folks is the fact that I've been there and seen it grow over the many years. I've come to some deep conclusions. One, there's no single system that works for every country, that every country needs to develop a system that is suitable and fitting for the conditions of that country. China's system has worked for China. If you look at the results over the many years, over the 46 years since I was there, over the 40-something years since formal ties have been established, the results speak for themselves. And so I'm a believer that, our system works for us, your system, the Chinese system works for China. We need to be respectful of that, and clearly Americans, I've been amazed. I'll stop there and just say that I've been amazed to be able to witness this change in China, and no one could have predicted it back 46 years ago.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, Neil. Actually, absolutely, you are the witness of this great transformation that has been taking place in China in the last 4 or 5 decades. I mean, since China joined the UN, and of course, we re-established its position at the UN, but also, since your father as the first envoy to China in 1974-75, that is really how the US and China gradually normalized the relations and paved the way for the great progress. I'm glad to hear that your father actually hosted the launch for the incoming delegates to the UN. That was really early on. That's to show I'm sure that your father was 8 years as a vice president of Ronald Reagan and also served as the president of the United States. I'm sure he has done a lot of memorable work, and also what he was saying that the two great giants should work together. I mean, absolutely, for the benefit of the mankind. He's absolutely right. So what do you still remember some of the things you've seen at the Beijing? You said you're 4 weeks there. I remember your father was named bicycle ambassador. He ride a bike. Yeah. Famous photo at the Tiananmen Square. What about you? When you and your brother and sister came?
No, we had the same experience. We rode bikes all over the place. It was really fun. We rode to Tiananmen Square. I distinctly remember pulling up to a stop sign, where the guards were there with their hands up and stuff, and the crowd of bikes were stopped and gathered. And when those of us that were, from America, kind of white guys, long nose, they'd look over and see us, and they'd almost fall off their bikes. Yeah, we went to the zoo, Henry, to go see the pandas and other animals. And you look behind us, and there's a bigger crowd following us at the zoo than there were looking at the animals. We were such a, anyway, but it was a friendly, adventure for us. One of the things I observed, and this is something Dad and I talked about during that trip, was that if you observed Chinese consumers, Chinese individuals walking by like a bike shop, or a shop that had like kitchen utensils or whatever, you could see in their eyes that they wanted more, that they wanted a better bike, a better flying pigeon or whatever bike. And so it was pretty clear that there were aspirations even then that have now led to this incredible, growth and realization of potential. But yeah, no, I have vivid memories of it. And now I go back to China, and cars everywhere. It's like totally transformed. It's an amazing transformation, high-speed rail, and internet connectivity everywhere. It's like a whole new world that couldn't have been imagined back in the bicycle riding days of the 1970s.
Yeah, great. You'll be really seeing China develop from bicycle kingdom to an automobile kingdom, now the largest automobile market in the world. That was really, you see that in the 4 decades time.
Oh, and it's leapfrogged. I mentioned high-speed rail. I mean, other countries, other developed countries, or even developing countries in the world have not been able to keep up with China in the deployment of high-speed rail. And I've been on many train rides that have been very efficient. They're quiet, they're fast, they're clean. And there's a leapfrog capability that China's enjoying that really sets it apart in many respects. Anyway, so yeah, it's gone from bicycles to the car consuming capital of the world, and also now leapfrog to the high-speed rail.
Yes, that's right. You see that all the development stages. So David, and you also lived in China for many years, and you've been actually 20 years involved with China as well as a diplomat, but also now you are still working on this. So what's your impression on China, and probably also what now you are president of the Bush China Foundation now. So what is your memories, and also how do you think the Bush Foundation, for both Neil and you, to take this forward? Maybe you can give me more discussion on that, David.
Well, Henry, thank you so much. And again, it's an honor to be with you, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. I first went to China in 1984, so 9 years later than Neil did, and yet I absolutely understand everything that Neil's saying in terms of the transformation that has occurred in China, and the degree to which average people since the 1970s and 1980s to the present date have seen their ability to make choices for themselves in their daily lives. That ability has grown in ways that, just as Neil said, were really unimaginable, I think, to the average Chinese citizen back in the 1970s or in the 1980s when I first visited China as a teenager, but just the ability to choose whether to go to college or what your major might be, or to choose to perhaps study abroad and do undergraduate work abroad rather than in China. The ability to choose where you live and to purchase a home, the ability to choose where you work or how long you work there. In the old unit system or danwei system back in the old days, you didn't have a say over where you worked and whether you could quit and so forth and so on. And now all those choices are available to average people all across the country. The ability to, have those kinds of decisions within your own grasp and within your own decision-making authority, that's probably the most fundamental transformation that I have seen in China, very much as Neil laid out. And I think if I were summarizing it in kind of one idea or one sentence, it would be that when I first visited China in the 1980s, I think the average citizen didn't feel that they had a lot of control over their own destiny with respect to these myriad really important decisions in their personal lives. But now, and certainly I think since the 1990s and unquestionably today, the average Chinese citizen, I think, feels that they have vastly more ability to shape their future than they did in the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. So it has been an incredible transformation. And of course, that's to say nothing of the physical transformation that's occurred in China and that you, Henry, and Neil were just discussing. At the Bush China Foundation, or the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China Relations, our mission is to advance the US-China relationship in ways that reflect the ethos, spirit, and values of President George H.W. Bush. And as you mentioned at the outset, when Neil founded the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China Relations with the blessing and support of his father, George H.W. Bush, that was very much the mindset. And I am so honored to be able to work side by side with Neil to carry forward the George H.W. Bush vision for the relationship. Henry, you mentioned one of President George H.W. Bush's most famous quotes when it comes to China, and it's one that we talk about all the time at the foundation. But I want to note that fundamentally, the George H.W. Bush vision for the relationship is grounded in two beliefs, core beliefs, I would say. Number one, that the US-China relationship is the single most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. And in fact, I would say in the history of the world. And number two, that no major international problem or challenge can be enduringly resolved in the absence of effective US-China cooperation. That's what President George H.W. Bush believed. That's what Neil believes. That's what I believe. And that's what our foundation is all about, is to try to facilitate US-China engagement and collaboration, not out of altruism, but because it is good for both countries, it is good for the relationship, and it's good for the world. And I couldn't be more proud to work for and with Neil and to be a part of this incredible foundation.
Yeah, thank you, David. Actually, absolutely. I mean, the Bush China Foundation has done many things. I noticed in the last 2 years, actually several years, you've done the conferences, you've done webinars related with many areas. So exactly, we need this foundation to actually to have better understanding and promote exchanges between our two countries.
Well, Henry,
yeah,
Henry, I'd like to piggyback off of that comment by reminding you and others that my dad, after he retired from the presidency, chose to be active in establishing dialogue, much like your program, Henry, between China and the United States, and he did so in the form of a conference, a US-China relations conference that he co-hosted with an old friend, Madam Li Xiaolin, on the Chinese side. That conference he attended, he actively promoted, he brought in, representation from the US side, the Chinese side, brought in equal representation. And I think he attended 5 or 6, David, do you recall? But he attended and hosted 5 or 6 of those. So that was basically the founding of our organization. Now, those are the roots of where our organization, sprouted from. And as he got older and couldn't actually participate in these conferences, he asked me to chair from the U.S. side, and it just spun out. Out of that spun the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China relations, and he was very pleased to see that the programmatic activity, starting with what he started, the conference, has now expanded to many other areas under David's very, very capable leadership. And by the way, I don't know if your audience would like to hear this, but David speaks like perfectly fluent Chinese. It's like apparently amazing, amazing Chinese. After 140 visits, you'd think I'd be able to say, like one more beer, please. But that's about ni hao and sai jian. But anyway, David speaks fluent Chinese. He's a great leader for our organization.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, absolutely. I see that George H.W. Bush has actually started this tradition of this China-U.S. conference for many years. I remember many friends has attended that and has speak highly of the efforts of the conference in promoting the exchanges and the dialogues and the understanding of the two countries. But also, in all this time, it is really very valuable, giving his advice and his presence. I'm glad that you succeeded him in doing this, and also now coupled with David. I know David is a perfect China hand. I mean, he spoke probably one of the best foreigners speak Mandarin that you could find. He has interpreted for many senior people too. So I remember when we invited David to come to speak at the CCG event in 2012. Which is almost 10 years ago. He already impressed me then, and also he's writing 2 Chinese books. I mean, out of the several books written in China, two of them written in Chinese. That is very rare for any foreigners to see that. So this is actually really great legacy and great tradition that we have, and so somehow, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, since both George. Your father, George H.W. Bush, and your brother, George W. Bush, are both Republican parties and a Republican president, and has actually made the most visit. Your father stayed in China for a year or two. Your brother made a 4 presidential visit, and 2 official visits, 1 APEC summit and 1 Olympic Games. There's a lot of good relationship building and the dialogue exchanges. But somehow, unfortunately, for the last several years, I mean, probably the last 5 years, particularly since Republican President Trump took the office, we see China-U.S. relations somehow, deteriorate quite a bit. And so this kind of deterioration, we don't know what are the reasons, but definitely, even now President Biden comes up, they're still saying, okay, China probably somewhat better now, but still, they say China can be cooperative, can compete, but also can be a rivalry. So we don't want to be a rivalry. But also, President Trump started this trade war, trade sanction with China. We see many Republicans actually calling for lift those tariffs, as I was just talking recently with Wendy Cutler, the former acting USTR, and she was saying, maybe we should lift those tariffs. It's no good for China, so for US as well. And recently, US-China Business Council have done a survey that find this tariff actually cost US almost 250,000 jobs and many costs. But still, China and US trade is still China imported as much as increase in steel, and also the trade has increased. So what do you assess this current China-U.S. relations, and how we can really improve that? How we can really maybe get a bit normalcy there, rather than we are now in such kind of deteriorated position. And of course, also I've been talking with a number of U.S. opinion leaders like Graham Allison, Joseph Nye, and of course, John Thornton just recently, and of course, think tank heads and Susan Thornton and Ambassador Roy. I mean, many of them. They all say, we shouldn't have a Cold War. We should not decouple, and they have all that kind of a consensus. Of course, how can both countries work better towards a better relation, given your foundation's view, maybe your personal view as well?
I might take a high level stab at this and then let David dive deeper. Sure. First of all, you referenced the deterioration in the relationship, and it strikes me that there are a number of converging factors that have led to the U.S. side becoming fearful of China's rise, and that fear is reflected in rhetoric that has become, under the Trump administration, quite harsh, and with that became kind of an isolationist approach of stepping back and not having dialogue. My dad believed at his core that that countries and families and friends need to stay in touch with one another in order to better understand one another, in order to put yourself in the other guy's shoes, so that when conflict arises, you can address those conflicts in a mature way. We got away from that for 5 years or so, and maybe even prior to that. David can give his analysis. That coupled with the U.S. problem of kind of America first, build the wall, anti-immigrant, we're the greatest country on the face of the planet, and to see China's economic rise to where it's now at parity or just behind the U.S. economy on a gross basis, not per capita, but on a gross basis. There are a lot of politicians are fearful of losing our prominence in that way. And then a third factor is politically, given that there's not very good information about China floating around in this ecosystem in the U.S. Politically, China's an easy target. We see politicians blasting the Communist Party as though it was the party that was kind of manifested itself in different ways very early in the People's Republic of China's history. So there's a lot of China bashing, and it gets to the Thucydides trap issue, that as China rises and America, being the prominent power in the world, faces this rising power, how are we going to react? And a lot of people in our country, many politicians, are reacting quite poorly to it and thinking that China is a existential threat to our economic and to our national security. And by the way, I'll quickly hasten to add that clearly any bilateral relationship is going to have issues between countries. We have issues with France, we have issues with Germany, we have issues with Israel, we have issues with our closest friends. We're going to have issues with China, and we're going to address, as Americans, we have values that we stand firmly behind. We're going to express those values in a way, hopefully in a way that's respectful and not finger pointing or in a derogatory way, but we'll express our values in the hopes that we can help shape outcomes and that kind of thing. But the ultimate goal should be to come together as often as possible in as many different ways as possible, and to resolve challenges, respectfully and maturely. I'm going to let David, talk about the tariffs thing. My view of the tariffs is it was such a stupid idea to start with. The idea of raising tariffs that was a tax to American consumers, hurting American business, which David can get into the statistics. I mean, it was a non-starter. Trump's idea, and I think people behind Trump, their idea was that if we have a trade deficit with a country, we've got to redress that by putting up tariffs and balancing out the trade. The reality is that in global trade, some countries have goods that are good quality goods that are provided at a lower cost that richer countries want to buy. And poorer countries, developing countries, can't afford to buy the stuff from the poorer countries. So therefore, there's going to be a trade imbalance, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing in economics 101 that says that a trade imbalance is unnatural or inappropriate or bad. And so it was a silly thesis in the first place. I think it may have been deep down inside, the logic might have been to be punitive towards the Chinese, to try to set the Chinese economy back, but that was illogical as well. So it was a failed policy that needs to be reversed. And anyway, David, I'll let you clean up my mess. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, you raised a lot of good points. Thank you. Yeah, no, David, please.
Well, Henry, thanks. And Neil, thank you. And just to pick up on the really good points that Neil made about tariffs. I mean, Neil and I both, even before we met each other 3 years ago, were both, very much, very critical of the US policy on tariffs and the Trump tariffs on the same grounds that they're bad for America. They're bad for American companies. They're bad for American workers. They kill jobs, they blow out the deficit, and they do nothing to solve any of the core problems that exist, that actually do exist between the United States and China in the trade area. And I agree fully with everything Neil just said with respect to tariffs. And we as individuals and as a foundation have been very outspoken, maybe more outspoken than almost any other entity in the country when it comes to the how bad for America the tariffs are. Let me cite a couple of things, and then I'll move, Henry, to the broader question that you've asked. But I think this needs to be said. I mean, the numbers are in, the jury is in with respect to the tariffs. We don't have to speculate or offer opinions about it. We can actually look at the factual record. Under President Trump, we had the highest US trade deficit with China in American history. Under President Trump, we had the highest average annual merchandise trade deficit with China of any presidency in the history. So to compare apples to apples, the entire presidency, the average annual deficit with China was higher under Trump than any other previous presidency. So those numbers speak for themselves. It wasn't just a one-year wonder type of phenomenon. It was 4 years. The US trade deficit with the world grew to record levels under President Trump. We lost manufacturing jobs, tens of thousands of them under President Trump. We lost jobs overall, 250,000, as Neil just cited, from the US-China Business Council under these imbecilic policies. The historic US trade surplus with China in agriculture became a trade deficit for the first time in 25 years, something that none of us thought was even possible. And of course, American consumers ended up paying more, to the tune of about $1,000 or even $2,000 a year more than they were before the tariffs came into play. By every single metric that you could possibly cite, the tariffs were just exactly as Neil said, an absolutely failed policy that was horrible for America, is horrible for America, and we need to get rid of it. The Trump tariffs were predicated on the idea that comparative advantage doesn't exist. And that is as un-Republican and un-American a thought as you could ever conceive. Comparative advantage does exist. And we have to get back to the idea that the pie gets bigger when countries produce what they're best at producing. And even imperfect trade is better than no trade. So we've got to get back to classical American thinking. And I want to say, before I transition just briefly, Henry, to your other question, that the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China relations, true to the values and beliefs of President George H.W. Bush, is a pro-business, pro-trade, pro-globalization organization, unapologetically, because we understand economics and we understand that trade is good for America, it's good for the world, and we want to move back in that direction, and we advocate in that direction. Henry, to your broader question about the fact that originally Republicans were at the cutting edge of getting the US-China relationship in its modern form going back to President Nixon and, of course, Secretary Kissinger, and obviously the incredible role that President George H.W. Bush played and other Republicans along the way. The point that I want to make is that for most of the last 50 years, up until about 5 years ago, the idea that engaging China and having a constructive and robust and healthy and functional relationship with China, it was not just a Republican idea. It was a bipartisan consensus that held through the presidencies of 7 or 8 presidents dating back to Nixon and through the end of the term of President Barack Obama. It only changed during President Trump's campaign and as he came into office. But there has always been a bipartisan consensus that it is good for America to engage China, notwithstanding the difficulties and I would frankly say the irreconcilable differences that we have between our countries. Even with all of that, that there is value and benefit to engaging China, working together, being clear-eyed about the relationship, certainly, but coming together to solve problems that neither country can solve on its own. That consensus has existed up until the Trump era. Now we have a new consensus, unfortunately, in official Washington, and that is that China is really the enemy of our nation. There's a vast swath of official Washington that seems to believe that. And there's a significant swath of the American public that has come to believe that. I think Neil and I and the Bush-China Foundation reject that idea and that belief. But I think that belief is rooted in two erroneous assessments of China's intentions. One, that China seeks to displace the United States and supplant the United States as the world's only superpower. And I think that is an absolutely fundamental misreading of what China actually wants to do. And number two, that China seeks to replicate its system all across the world and create a bunch of countries that look exactly like China, and basically to push forward its system as across the world, so that there are more systems that look like China's than there are today. I think those are incorrect understandings of what China actually seeks to do. And when the fundamental premises of US policy toward China are wrong, the resulting policies that purport to address those concerns are going to veer off course. And I think that's what we've seen over the last several years. So, we need to have a sharp focus on US interests and to get the emotions out of our policy formulation and policy execution and focus, as President George H.W. Bush did, on the long-term interests of our nation. And I think if we do that, we can get this relationship back on course.
Yeah, great. Thank you, both Neil and David. Excellent points. I think that you're right. For the last 5-6 years, there seems to be more misunderstanding between the two countries. And I think we all need to really work hard to really to get a dialogue, get a communication, and get the right understanding. Exactly like what we're doing tonight as well. And I think that trade is absolutely so obvious that since the Second World War, the trade boom has actually give the prosperity to the world and actually prevented the Third World War. And we are still living in largely peace and prosperities because of the trade. And this is actually a competitive advantage you talk about, that David Ricardo's theory that, the country does best, that maybe we should exchange. And the US has many areas, technology, US financial power and dominance in the internet and many areas. So China has been doing well in infrastructure and also many other. I see a lot of collaboration there. But just unfortunately now we're actually, we're facing, the whole world is facing a huge challenge. We've been, in this pandemic, this COVID-19, now we're getting probably COVID-2012 now. It's really still, cutting us off, at least for travel. So what do you think that we should really work together on this? Because I see this as the biggest opportunities. Like I was talking to Susan Sontag, the former Assistant Deputy Secretary of the US. She was saying, look, I mean, the COVID-19 could be the best occasion for the US and China to let bygone be bygone. Let's concentrate on this common threat, enemy number one to the humankind, rather than we have actually, now because of COVID-19, we have actually divided even more so. I mean, you have this origin of tracing and the blaming on China, but also we see, finger pointing as well. And how do you think that we can fight this pandemic? And how can we revive the world travel? How WHO can really work together? I mean, US now is maybe lifting some of the lockdown, but then you have the you have some surge again in some area. But what's the experience U.S. has and China has? Maybe we can really work together. Vaccine recognition, travel kind of exchanges, and now we see that U.S. just according to the U.S. embassy here, in the last 3 months, from May, June, and July, U.S. embassy has issued almost 85,000 student visa. We have a miles-long queue at the Pudong International Airport. So, students going back to the United States, and yet U.S. student can't come to China. So how can we really, get this U.S.-China working together on this pandemic fighting, rather than we, point the finger and shout at each other?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a question I would ask on a number of major topics that affect the sustainability of life on Earth for humans, including climate change, food insecurity, everything health related. The pandemic is kind of the most obvious and most pressing matter that you brought up. But because of climate change, we have all kinds of natural disasters. How can we learn to either alter the course of this climate change so that the Earth will be able to carry on for many more years beyond the current trajectory? So these are big issues, and clearly the two largest economies in the world, as David pointed out in his opening comment, have to work together. In fact, it's hard to imagine not solving these issues without the collaboration of China and in the United States. There's a clear mandate and necessity for all of us to share our common humanity in addressing these kinds of issues. And I agree with you, the frustration over the finger pointing. I mean, especially at the beginning of the outbreak, we had we had messaging coming out of the White House that said, oh, it's just going to be here for a little while. We have 13 cases. It's all going to go away and blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, we're going to have a mask mandate, but I'm not going to wear a mask. And, yeah, everybody should get vaccinated, but no, there's no real push. And so there's a huge kind of anti-vax movement in the United States. We don't have a national pride or national drive to combat this pandemic in a way that we as a nation could, but we should learn from one another. We should be open-minded about looking at what New Zealand has done and what Australia has done, what China has done, what other countries have done. We should share the best technologies that exist for vaccine development and have manufacturers all over the world convert their manufacturing to vaccine manufacturing of qualified vaccines so that the global population could be more readily vaccinated against this pandemic and the spread of it through the various variants. The drugs that can be administered, all of these kinds of things there needs to be more of a environment of collaboration, which sadly doesn't exist today. And I'm convinced that things will change over time. I may be the only guy out there that says this, but I do believe that this administration is already creating more opportunities for exchange and dialogue and that kind of thing. And inevitably, when you sit down and you have dialogue with counterparts, good things come out of it. Better understanding and an addressing of serious issues. And the topic of collaborating on the pandemic and healthcare related issues in general should be front and center on the table for discussion.
Yeah, great. I think you mentioned those very important issues, and we should really work together on this pandemic fighting, vaccine recognition, and also learn from each other. Absolutely. I mean, we need a lot of cooperation in combating the COVID-19. And actually, this could be a punishment of the nature that we are not really respect sustainable and climate change. It could, so this is a huge lesson for us. So David, what's your take on this?
Well, Henry, thank you. And I think Neil has said it really well. I would just amplify one point with respect to COVID-19, and let me make a broader point at the outset. Absolutely, COVID-19 and pandemics generally, and global public health even more broadly, are areas where the United States and China should be collaborating, because these are the very definition of the kinds of issues, and they're not the only ones, where no one country, by definition, can solve these problems. These problems require a collaboration from all the major players in the world. And instead of thinking of COVID-19 here in the United States as a kind of wedge issue between the United States and China, we ought to be thinking of it, just as Neil said, and Henry, as you said, as an opportunity for collaboration, not because it's a warm and fuzzy or altruistic thing to do, but because lives depend on our ability to collaborate. And as I said in an interview a little over a year ago, in May or so of last year, you know, when a house is on fire, the first thing you do is you say, who's in the house and how do we get them out? You don't say who started the fire. And yet we saw in the United States this propensity to demonize China, to lambast China and assume the absolute worst about its motivations. What we really should have been talking about at that time was, how do we save lives and how do we work together to bring as early an end to this pandemic as we possibly can. And with respect to this particular facet of the issue, I just want to say here what I and we as a foundation have said emphatically many times, and that was that the racially charged and I would say racist rhetoric that emanated from President Trump and other senior members of the executive branch, the then Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, and members of Congress, was despicable. It was repugnant, it was deplorable, and it was wrong. And it was far beneath the dignity of any office holder in this nation. It is not how we should be communicating. The notion that people were using terms such as, quote, China virus, or quote, Chinese virus, or even worse, quote, Kung flu. This is a disgrace. This brings shame on our nation for any serious political figure elected or appointed to use that kind of reprehensible language. And of course, as a result, and predictably, it drove the numbers of anti-Asian racist violence through the roof. And that is deplorable and absolutely tragic. And so we as a foundation spoke out and continue to speak out about this. You know, we've got to get back to and I think we are now under this administration, a much more mature and less juvenile style of communication. Because when you start throwing around these types of terms, any possibility of collaboration goes out the door, even if there really are valuable areas where we ought to be collaborating. So the language matters, the communication matters. And boy, what I wouldn't give to have, a way of thinking about communication and thinking about bringing people together of the type that we saw under the presidency of George H.W. Bush. To his credit, President Joe Biden has gotten rid of that kind of language. He's banned it from the White House. He said he will fire people and he's done it, for using language that is not appropriate for the White House of our nation. And I think we're getting back to some of the norms that were established under many presidents. But that is a really important part of the COVID piece. If we don't communicate in a mature and professional and serious and business-like way, any hope of collaboration that would benefit all of us becomes very remote.
Yeah, thank you, Neil and David, for your very open and frank and very positive discussion. I agree. I absolutely agree with you. I think that we need to improve our communication dialogues, and I mean the COVID-19 already separated us. We can't have a face-to-face meetings, so we should really be careful of our languages and of the discussion and in exchanges. I'm glad to see President Biden, when he comes to office, he actually signed an executive order banning the use of ethnic language refers to the virus. So that is a good sign. So we hope that things can get better. I know that now we can talk a bit more on that, but President Biden is already over 6 months in office, And China and US, we had quite a several rounds of discussion. We had Alaska encounter and with Secretary Blinken and China's senior diplomats. Of course, recently we had Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman come to Tianjin. We had a second round of discussion, and so it seems, of course, the second time I would say it's better than the first time, but still, well, one of the best was actually, I think, was former Secretary of State, now Special Envoy John Kerry's visit to China first time, and they issued a joint communique on the climate change between the collaboration. And again, John Kerry is planned to visit China in the next several weeks. I know that also John Thornton, the honorary chair of Brookings, actually currently is in China, and actually he met the Minister of Environment and had a lot of constructive dialogues. So we hope, we can really now facing those huge issues, facing those, the more challenges that U.S. and China can really, work together on those mostly critical issues to the mankind, to the whole world, to the 7.5 billion people, because the number one and number two largest economy in the world have a moral responsibility to do that. So how can we really improve on that? And so what do you think about where are the low-hanging fruit? Can we start climate change so we can get some positive news? We can get some positive message across the countries. We can, now we have the student back. Can we have a U.S. student back to China? Or can we have the consulate resumed in both Houston and where both of you based in Texas and in China too? So things like that. Probably Neil, you can give some first.
I'm actually, I think I may pass the buck over to David. I'm curious about his response on the student travel. You've mentioned that a couple of times. I mean, one of the great blessings of connectivity is having so many thousands of students come to the United States every year we're a land of immigrants, and I know these students aren't immigrating, but I just think it's wonderful how America, has taken kind of the best of talent from all over the world. They come to this part of the world, they learn and go back to their countries or stay and help us build our economies. And there's so much value to those student experiences, both the U.S. students going to China and vice versa, Chinese students coming here. David, what's the prospect for that activity cranking back up again?
Yeah, well, Neil, thank you. And a couple of points in response to Henry's really good questions. One, first of all, with respect to students, it is encouraging to see us get back toward something that looks more normal in terms of the flow of students and the flow of people within the constraints of COVID-19, which are significant, but at least we're moving back in the right direction. There was a 12-month period where year over year, we actually saw, and I think it was from 2019 to mid 2020, we actually saw a literally 99% drop in US student visa issuance to Chinese students from, I think it was 80,000 to 800 approximately. That was the scale. At one point we issued 80,000 visas, and then over the next 12 months we issued 800. Some of that obviously was COVID, but a lot of it was also just a fundamentally different view under the Trump administration about the value, or what they would have regarded as the lack of value in having students from China come to this country. What Neil, what you understand and what I understand, and I think what Henry understands, is that actually there's huge value in having students from all over the world come to this country and contribute to our research and development, contribute to scholarship at universities, contribute to the development of new ideas and innovation, new companies. And the notion that by turning off that spigot and shutting that down, that's good for America, is just about as dumb an idea in terms of the modern 21st century economy as I can imagine. And so to see it move back toward a more normal level, at least in terms of Chinese students coming to the United States, And I certainly hope we'll see an analogous upward tick in US students getting back to China once the overall health situation allows for that. These exchanges are great for our countries, and we need to increase them, not decrease them. Just as a side note relative to Henry's question, in terms of what's the low-hanging fruit, in addition to getting student numbers back up, I think we need to get the Fulbright program back up and running again. We need to get other cultural and educational exchanges back up and running. We need to get the US Peace Corps functioning in China again, assuming China still welcomes that. Yes, of course, Henry, you're right. We need to get the 2 consulates back up and running again. Neil and I both feel very strongly about that, and so many other Americans. We've got to, we're not helping anybody by shutting down the Chinese consulate general in Houston or the US consulate general in Chengdu. It hinders both countries' abilities to provide services for citizens, to support business and trade and so forth and so on. So there are a number of things in that area. But Henry, the final point I would make that I think goes to your question is there are areas that the Biden administration identified very early on as areas that are fruitful and that are potentially very beneficial to both countries in terms of collaboration. One is public health. We've talked about that. And let me also note, both China and the United States made some very serious mistakes in their early handling of COVID-19. There's no question about it. That being said, the question now is, how do we actually make the situation better? So we've talked about COVID-19, but also the issue of climate change, just as Neil noted, and Henry, as you noted at the outset, the issue of arms control, the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, including on the Korean Peninsula, but not limited to that particular space. Now the issue of Afghanistan. The United States and China need to come together and talk about this incredible and tragic situation that we now see in Afghanistan. And I think there's much to discuss there. The question of Iran's nuclear ambitions and other issues, piracy on the high seas. There are a whole host of areas where it's in each country's interest to work together. And we just need to set emotions aside. Yes, we disagree with China. We as a nation disagree with China on any number of issues. And China disagrees with America. Yes, China does some things that are immensely problematic for America, no question. And America does some things that are very problematic for China. We have to set that aside, not in a clear-eyed way, and focus on where we can make a difference. And there are a lot of areas where we can, and that's what I hope we'll see over the coming years.
Yes, thank you, David and Neil. I think absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. I think that both U.S. and China, being the 2 largest economy, has a really very strong responsibility and to work together. I mean, you're right. I mean, the issues, the chaotic situation in Afghanistan. Where is next? How can we really work together on that? Should we really, China, U.S. and the country in the region should really work out a post-war plan, maybe for the peace and stability there. And of course, there's the issue of Korea, North Korea, Korea Peninsula, and there's issues of Iran, and China was one of the talking parties there. And so there are many international issues. But what's more important, I think that this world economy is also need us to really work together to put it up also for the developing countries, for Africa, for Latin America, so many countries that we really need to work together. So absolutely, we need to put aside our differences and maximize our common positions. So David, I noticed that you actually, in January this year, when you talked at the Hong Kong forum that organized by US-China Business Exchange Foundation there, that you talk about the way forward. You mentioned about 6 points there, which I think is really interesting. You said, of course, we should reopen 2 consulates in Houston and Chengdu, since you and Georgia and Neil are both in Texas, where the consulate was located. I'm from Chengdu. I mean, I really want to see the consulate open there too. And also, the second recommendation said restore the Fulbright program. And third recommendation said restore the US Peace Corps presence in China. And also the fourth recommendation is the United States government should cease desist from its effort in the shutdown Confucius Institute. And the number 5 is more openness in trade and investment, but also to people-to-people exchanges. And also 6 is to think about creating an international visitor leadership program. China to think, creating this program to between the thousands of South Americans and Chinese in both directions. So you're right, because you are one of the early scholars come to China. You can witness firsthand. So for those things, plus the climate change, I mean, can we really do more? And also you can elaborate on those points. That very good point you made.
Well, Henry, thank you so much for noting that. And let me just say, I think there are, we are facing a very turbulent and contentious and difficult and challenging time in the relationship right now. It is going to be very difficult to do big things at this moment because of the tenor of the rhetoric and the mindset in Washington. And for that matter, you sometimes hear some heated rhetoric from the Chinese side, et cetera. And so there's a lot of tension there. But so the question becomes, what can be done? And the things that you noted that I had talked about earlier this year, and some of which I mentioned in this discussion, are things that are actually doable. They're not things that are really that controversial. They're not things that are that difficult to do. Most of them can be done with a presidential executive directive or executive order, rather, as they were, in many cases, undone by Trump with an executive order. So can they be restored by the same mechanism? And so you're not talking about new legislation, which would be a very, very difficult thing to achieve in this environment. And so all of those things, I think, are just, I propose that we do them not because they're good for China, but because they're good for America. And yes, they're also good for the relationship. And they can serve as confidence building measures that can get these two countries moving back in a direction where we're actually speaking to each other in a business-like way and focusing on solving problems. The one thing I would amplify, Henry, from the kind of list that you just mentioned of proposals I had made earlier in the year, is I do think China, this issue of what I referred to as the International Visitor Leadership Program, or IVLP, that is a program that exists in the United States, whereby many thousands of foreign citizens come to the United States at the expense of the American government, the federal government, and the US taxpayer. And they come and spend 2 or 3 weeks, it used to be 4 weeks, in the United States, and they learn about this country firsthand by traveling across the country, meeting people, and learning about America, as we would say, warts and all, not just propaganda, but hey, here's the things we're doing well, here's the things we're not doing well, and going back with a better and more textured understanding to their country of the United States. I think if China were to do something like that, it would be very beneficial, because not all, but many of the harshest critics of China in the United States have never been in China or never lived in China. Unlike Neil, unlike me, and unlike many others, they haven't actually interacted with Chinese people at a human level in many, many cases. And so they don't necessarily have their fingers on the pulse of what's happening in that country in the same way. And so I think China would be well served to create what I've called, and what the US government calls, an international visitor leadership program, and literally bring thousands or even tens of thousands of Americans to China every year in the way that the United States brings foreign citizens, including Chinese, to the United States, and help more Americans get a much better understanding of the real China, warts and all, the good things, the bad things, the things we agree with, the things we disagree with, because that foundation of understanding can lead to some really good things. And I think China underinvests in people-to-people exchanges of this type. And I think China would be well served to invest more. And frankly, the United States would be well served to invest more as well. We need it more than ever during this very challenging period in US-China relations.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that we hope that we can restore the Fulbright program from the US, but particularly you make a very good recommendation that China probably should set up international visitor leadership program that we can have, like US did in the past, and we can bring hundreds and thousands of US leaders and things like that to visit China and also to understand China, because seeing is believing, and you know, when people come and then really interact and have this human touch and human bond, that will greatly change many things going forward. As a matter of fact, CCG, we recently did launched international young leaders dialogue program together with a partner, and actually that program we are not able to attract people from outside China, but we're doing those international young talents already in China. That was really going on very well. We had organized 6 trips, visited 6 provinces, over 100 of them, and among 30 of them actually wrote to President Xi, and the President Xi replied to them, and it was really encouraging, this kind of a move, and hope to bring more people to come to China, to visit China and see the real China. So I think your suggestion is just very timely, and I'm sure this could be a very good recommendations. So now, Neil, I would like to ask a question for you as well. And you're based in Texas. We know Texas is really abundant for the energy. The energy cooperation between China and the US is one of the big area. I remember when President Trump came to China in 2017, he signed over $250 billion various deals, and a big chunk of that is energy deal, and from Texas, from Alaska. So we see, before he started the trade war, we see a lot of cooperations going on then, and also, of course, I did some study there, and because if you want to import the energy or whether shale gas or LNG from the inland of Texas to the port, and then port to China, the cost from inland to the Texas port is double the tax port to China. So there's lack of infrastructure in the Texas in really export to China, and actually China companies could help on that, on those infrastructures, but JV with US companies to do that. So that's one area. The other area is also Texas is a great center for US in the airspace and aviation and things like that. And there could be potential for China and US to collaborate in our aerospace. We see now the famous businessman now flying out of space. I mean, I remember they are saying when they look out from the space, look at the Earth, we are really one. We are one village, one human being raised in a nest. How can we really fight each other? So probably now, from those points, in addition to consulate and other things, the area can collaborate. Like from a Texas point of view, and or US in that matter. What are those areas? I mean, maybe further to promote that.
First of all, I'm going to reflect back on David's comment about comparative advantage. That trade is really about comparative advantage. And one of the great advantages that Texas has, and that the United States up until recently has had, is that we've had a surplus of oil production and natural gas production. I can't speak to the infrastructure issues and the cost of transport from West Texas, from the Permian Basin to the coast of Texas, and then shipping it around. But to the extent that there's a demand in China for these products, and to the extent that we can provide the supply to meet that demand on a cost reasonable basis, we should engage in that trade, period. It's just as simple as that. And the trade deficit will be reduced by it, which is, I really don't care about the trade deficit, but it's just a fact that it would be reduced, and some politicians will be able to brag about how they brought the trade deficit down. So yeah, there's clearly, and I love your suggestion that we should be very open to having joint venture collaboration, investment in infrastructure by Chinese in joint ventures with American companies to get access to these supplies. Makes total sense to me. You mentioned aerospace. The Bush China Foundation has been a co-sponsor of an event that's happened 3 years in a row called the International Symposium for the Peaceful Use of Space Technology with a focus on health. And this organization has brought together leading space-related agencies and organizations from around the world, from Europe, France, and Germany, from Japan and Russia, the United States. And it's been pretty remarkable. The last couple of sessions have been in person in China, but virtual for all those outside of China. But the first one that was held in Hainan Island was very successful in bringing people together. And yeah, I'm not sure about the privatization of space and how that, because there's going to be competition, to get out there to try to attract customers, to make the economics of space travel for tourists, competitive. But there's all kinds of science that can be gleaned from space related work. And that's the kind of science that's going to benefit humankind. And to the extent that China brings something of value to that exploration, and we bring something of value, and the Europeans bring something, we should collaborate, no doubt about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot of interest with US and China can collaborate, and there's a lot of things that we can work together. But now, and as China now, GDP is also getting larger, but also it seems that maybe with a number of years, China may surpass US on the GDP status, but maybe per capita still far behind. But what do you think about this? How can we really now accept each other, maybe coexist with each other peacefully? We cannot. I remember probably you said before that the U.S. has a system that fits U.S. China has a system that fits China. We should not really try to change each other or something. Can we really reach that kind of a common understanding, or maybe how we can do that?
I'll give you an example. The topic of Afghanistan came up. My brother, President George W. Bush, and his wife, my sister-in-law Laura, have very strong feelings about their concerns for the rights of women and children in Afghanistan. With the Taliban coming back into control, there was a small military force there that helped support the Afghan troops of 2,500 or so. I'm not quite sure of the numbers, but very small compared to what's on the Korean Peninsula today. And it seems to me that for civilized nations around the world that are concerned for the rights of these women and these children that may be thrown back into the dark ages or the stone ages through this change of leadership, that civilized nations would be motivated to work together to keep a presence there, to maintain the stability. The American people are kind of tired of being the sole, what's perceived to be the sole protector. There were allies there, but not in great forces. But the American people elected Biden with his promise to withdraw. President Trump made the commitment to withdraw. A better strategy would have been to say, let's get countries from all over the world, people that have a notion of what it is to be civilized, and find our common humanity and work together, to secure the rights of the people of Afghanistan, not to nation build, but to be protectors of those basic human rights. So that may be idealistic and naive, but I do believe we're going to get there. The world is becoming so connected, so close, so there's everything is far more transparent than it has been in the past, and so where there's a wrong that needs to be righted, we need to work together to right that wrong. And of course, I'm on the edge of very controversial issues here, specifically related to the treatment of minorities in Xinjiang, for example. I just hope the Chinese are very, very transparent about what's going on there, and that the truth be known so that the world can settle down. And and in the meantime, I'm all in favor of America expressing our values, that where there are human rights challenges, let's bring people from all over the world to put pressure on it to address those human rights related issues. And that relates to Afghanistan and other places in the world today.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah. I think that's exactly. I think the more communication and as I said, the visit of each other is so crucial. As a matter of fact, I mean, Xinjiang now is really welcoming foreigners to visit. I mean, so because of the COVID, we really hope that more people come to Xinjiang and visit that, and that probably will clear things up, as you said.
I've been to Xinjiang twice, by the way, not recently, but I've been there twice and
okay, we
really
hope
enjoy.
you come back again. We'd love to
Okay.
show you around
Okay.
again. Yeah, please, yes. So David, what's your take on the question about how we can really, can we really coexist peacefully together, and maybe gradually accept each other differences? Because, for example, this COVID-19, China has been managing well with China basically putting a lot of community interests on individual interests, whereas US is really emphasize human rights and cannot violate, and that the whole society actually has less freedom, whereas China probably individually you suffer a bit, but the whole society gained a lot of freedom and right on that. So what's your ideas on that?
Well, Henry, thanks. That's a great question. And let me just say, first of all, back on the topic of energy, I want to make a quick point, and then I'll come to the broader and very important topic that you've raised in terms of how we can, go forward together. On energy, just to amplify some of the really good points that Neil made, we at the Bush China Foundation care a lot about the issue of energy. We've been advocates for an idea that we coined, called the US China Energy Free Trade and Investment Agreement, or US EFTIA, or FTIA as we call it. And the US China Energy Free Trade and Investment Agreement is an idea that we are advocating, that we're building out, and that we hope we can advocate for the implementation of. And it's a very simple concept at the conceptual level. And it's exactly what Neil said. In terms of energy, the United States has it, China needs it, so let's do it. It's pretty simple. We can genuinely create a win-win in the energy area. And our idea is take energy out of the trade war, fast track it for a more robust trade and exchange, and create the legislative and policy context and regulatory predictability so that the infrastructure investments, Henry, that you mentioned can be made, and so that we can export, for example, liquefied natural gas, which Texas has in huge abundance, to China, which has said that it wants to double its liquefied natural gas consumption over the next 10 years or so, and move from 7% of the energy mix to 15%. It's a perfect scenario where we can sell something that we have, China can buy something that it needs, we can put a Texas-sized dent in the US deficit for those who care about that, just as Neil said exactly correctly. And everybody walks away a winner, and America walks away a winner, but the state of Texas really walks away a winner, and others that produce liquefied natural gas. It's an obvious idea. The reason that we don't see the kind of trade in that area is because of the legislative policy and regulatory unpredictability that we have seen surge in the last several years. Nobody wants to make the investment of billions or tens of billions of dollars that would allow this trade to occur in terms of terminals that can deal with liquefied natural gas and so on. And the bottom line is, this is an easy one and we ought to do it. So we've been advocating that. And just very briefly, we've also advocated for the idea of the United States and China actually working together, governments, former government officials, business leaders, nonprofits, and others, to come together to mitigate the impact of energy poverty in the developing world, and specifically in what we might term the bottom billion, to use the term that was coined by others, by another author. And to one of the big problems among the 1/7 of the population that is least fortunate or poorest is energy poverty. And so what can the United States and China do together to alleviate and mitigate the impacts of energy poverty on that segment of the global population? We're working with the Rockefeller Foundation on a really interesting project in that area. But Henry, to your broader point, I think the one thing I just want to say is that those of us, I think, who understand China well and who've lived there, been there many times, et cetera, understand something that we don't often say, but that I think is true. And that is a number of the differences between the United States and China are simply irreconcilable, period. We are never going to see eye to eye on those issues. We're never probably going to see eye to eye on the issue of Taiwan, for example. China has its view, the United States has its view. The views are essentially irreconcilable. We're not going to see the issue of the South China Sea the same way. China has its long-held view. The United States and many other countries have a very different view. We're not going to get to a point where we have a meeting, come away from it and say, hey, now we agree on it. So there are some irreconcilable, and by the way, same for Hong Kong, same for the issue of human rights and a number of other issues. So the point is, given that there are differences that will always be part of the fabric of the relationship between our two countries, how do we manage the relationship in light of that? And I think the view that Neil and that I and that the Bush-China Foundation and other moderates in the United States, the few of them that seem to be out there at this time, is it can be done. We can have a business-like and a functional, constructive, results-oriented, mutually beneficial and politically sustainable relationship, even with those differences being unreconciled. And we ought to aspire to do that. And rather than say, look, because we disagree on all these different profound issues, let's take our ball and go home. We advocate the opposite. We advocate, Neil advocates, I advocate, the Bush-China Foundation, for the idea that this is all the more reason that we need to come together with a problem-solving mindset. So that's what I would say. I think it can be done. It just requires the vision that George H.W. Bush had, the vision that Neil has as our founder and chairman, and the vision that we seek to give expression to at this foundation. It's possible to do. We're going to keep doing everything we can to move in that direction. And I know that there are many in China that feel the same way, and many in America as well. And we're going to continue to stand strong for that sensible, common sense, moderate perspective on how to move this relationship forward.
Thank you, Neil and David. Actually, you made a lot of worthwhile notice point. I think that you're right. We should probably really maximize the commonalities, the common ground, and minimize the differences. Of course, as you said, because of the culture, historical and geographically, all those big differences. There are some differences probably will remain for a long time to come. But definitely, we have such a huge interest, a common interest, not only for the both countries but for the world, that we should really work together so that we can really avoid a catastrophe or maybe a hot war. I mean, these days we had a lot of populism and nationalism on the rising on both sides, and that is really dangerous. I think we, as you said, moderate, but maybe cool heads and realistic. I think we need more people like that in both places. So absolutely important. Now my staff was telling me we had live from several portals. We have over 200,000 viewers watching us and listen to us. And but we had also collected some questions from online viewers as well, media as well. We have a few questions, so I just read them out. And we have one question from CGTN. Basically, was saying in which area that can China and U.S. cooperate among the pandemic area? I think we already probably covered some of that. But what do you think of Biden's Afghanistan policy? And can China and the U.S. work together in Afghanistan, and how? Those are from CGTN. And then we have another two from China News Agency. Regarding the investigation of origin of virus, some argue that there's more politics into that rather than the scientists into that. And so what do you thought on that, how we can get out of that? And how should China and U.S. cooperate on fighting against a pandemic? So basically, they've been maybe linger on those questions that we touched upon briefly. Perhaps you could give your answer to that as you see fit, and maybe Neil, and then we'll have David. But of course, with the question we just covered before.
I'll start on the last question you raised about the origins of the virus. I'm not as concerned, for example, about the origin of climate change, whether humans cause climate change or whether it's a natural occurrence or whether it's some combination. The fact is there's climate change and we need to address it. And there's clearly a role for the US and China and all the nations of the world to lock arms in addressing it. China's got its 2060, carbon neutrality pledge. The governments at all levels, the private sector will be unified in their effort to do that. And I have no doubt that China will be major players in the collaboration to try to address climate change. I mean, the same thing kind of rings true to me with the virus. Who cares where it originated? Whether it originated, in a lab or from a bat or from the United States or from wherever it originated, who cares? The fact is we have a pandemic that continues to affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of people all across the globe. And there's a pressing need for mature, civilized nations in the world to work together. And so David may have more specific ideas on how we can work together, but it seems like collaboration is very natural when it comes to something as big as this and the origins of it. And I will put a little caveat that, I reject the idea that there was some malicious effort to release a virus, a virus that causes a pandemic. I think that's a crazy notion that there was some intent from one side or the other, to do this on purpose. So you throw away the crazy conspiracy theories and just assume that there was, an origin of some kind. Doesn't matter where it originated. Let's deal with it together.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I mean, we can't find where AIDS originated. Well, some say in Africa, some say in America. Who cares? I mean, let's cure it. Let's find a cure for that. And exactly. Also, I mean, how would it be so silly for Chinese to invent a virus and the cure itself is started in China? It doesn't make sense. Yeah. So it's a huge cost.
Sense.
Yeah. So David, what's your answers to those questions?
Yeah, well, thanks, Henry. And let me just start by saying I completely agree with what Neil just said, that the idea that this was something that was unleashed upon the world with intentionality is ludicrous and just not a serious idea. Why would a country unleash something on itself and everyone else that it trades with and so forth? It just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, again, there are areas, I think, within the context of COVID-19 and pandemics more generally that we ought to work on together. Let me make one point at the outset, which is COVID-19 is not going to be the last pandemic that we as a world ever face. I mean, we know that. There will periodically be pandemics. They'll originate here, they'll originate there, meaning this country, country A, country B. And we will have to cope as a global community with pandemics forever, periodically. And so learning how to work together and to actually solve medical and public health and epidemiological problems is a good thing for our countries to be able to do. I think we were able to do that to a greater degree when the relationship was less politically charged than it is at present. And we've gotten away from it, but it's unfortunate for all of us that is so. And rather than focusing on the blame game and demonizing and so forth in any direction, just as Neil said, and as I said earlier, we should have been focused on solving the problem right at the outset. I'll be honest, as I've said, and I said in the Global Times, one of China's prominent newspapers, back in May of last year, that I think both the United States and China first chronologically and the United States second chronologically because of the way that the pandemic developed, didn't respond in the earliest stages of COVID-19 to the pandemic with the openness, the transparency, or the sense of urgency that we should have. And I think China made significant mistakes in its early handling. And I think the United States also made significant mistakes in its early handling. Given that, the question now, just as Neil said, is how do we actually work together to solve problems for real people? And I think we can do that in the areas of research and development, vaccine, comparing notes on what's working, what's not working, bringing medical practitioners and public policy experts together around the issue of the Delta variant, specifically helping each other as we did in the early stages in both directions. With providing materiel, personal protective equipment. That was a good thing to do. I'm glad that we as a foundation were a part of that, along with many others in both directions. So there are a lot of things that I think we can do, but fundamentally focusing on solving a public health challenge rather than politicizing a medical issue and a public health issue is what we need to be focused on. On the issue of Afghanistan, I think there is clearly an opportunity now because of, unfortunately, the tragic circumstances in the country with the Taliban retaking Afghanistan. There is an opportunity and I think a need for the United States and China as players that have significant interests in Afghanistan coming together and really talking to each other honestly about what we're thinking about the situation, what our assessments of the situation are, what our plans are as individual countries relative to how each country intends to engage Afghanistan going forward. And I think there's a lot that could be done to exchange views. And in fact, the Bush-China Foundation this October, in less than 2 months, will be bringing people together on this topic to kind of get a conversation started. And I'm sure others will be doing that as well. But I think anytime there's a global crisis or a global challenge, the two countries, among others, that have to be at the table are the United States and China as the two largest economies, two members of the P5, permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, major global players with presences across economically and in terms of development politically across the globe. And Afghanistan is a clear case where I think there's benefit to sitting down and saying, what do you think about what's happening there? And here's what we think about what's happening there. Just at that level alone, there's utility. So, all of these are areas where I think there is room for improvement. And I hope that we'll see that improvement because, as I've often said, the United States cannot be all that it was meant to become without China. And China cannot be all that it was meant to become without America. We need each other, whether we like it or not, we do. And we've got to get this relationship right because the consequences of getting it wrong are far-reaching and very unpleasant.
Great. Thank you, Neil and David, both for voicing such a very clear message. I think that is really very stimulating for people in both countries and probably to the world as well. I think you're absolutely right. We really need to concentrate on working together in solving the pandemic problem and the challenges and preventing the future pandemics. As you said, it may not be just this time, it could come again. And we really have to work together as a human race rather than as a country. So probably we should have a summit of some kind, or maybe WHO should convene big countries together to really work out some recommendations for how to work together. Very importantly, I think that is really facing the whole countries in the world. And of course, Afghanistan, I agree with Neil that probably even before the last evacuation, the US should get every country work together. We could talk, have a country in the region and have a discussion. Maybe we could have the UN to play more active role, or even have a UN peacekeeping force to safeguard the evacuation to prevent future disasters. So there's many things we could talk. Absolutely, we need to bring all parties together. So now, given the time, we probably come to the conclusion of our dialogue. I think we started with this dialogue with the 50 years of US-China exchanges. Started with, of course, with the Nixon visit 50 years ago. Started with China joined the UN when George H.W. Bush as a US UN ambassador then, and had the, Neil was mentioned that they had a really great encounter then with the Chinese delegation. but also with the legacy of both presidents. I mean, President George H.W. Bush, but also George W. Bush as well. I mean, George Jr. President as well. I think that the legacy is have more exchanges, more dialogues, more understanding of each other, and then also maybe we should try to avoid major disasters and deterioration, and we should really seek the common ground and minimize the difference. So maybe just in concluding words from both of you, what's your final message to our audience here in China, maybe also around the world, that given the 50 years of anniversary of exchanges between China and US, with China joining the UN for 50 years, with China, first secret visit by Dr. Kissinger to China 50 years ago, and also with the two presidents of Bush, maintaining, promoting, and strengthening the ties during those past years. How can we look forward, and how can we really going forward, given this, Bush, both President Bush, that's really proud of. I'm very honored to have a new Bush the dialogue with us. Your family is really probably one of the greatest in the history that produced the two presidents of the United States. That now you have a Bush Foundation to still working on Bush China Foundation. That shows that the family is really care about this relationship. So we want to hear the last word from Neil, and also from the president of CEO of Bush China Foundation, David Firestein. So Neil, why don't you go first?
Well, thank you, Henry. I think I'll start by reiterating that my father often said, publicly, openly said, that the bilateral relationship between the United States and China was the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And it was prescient of him to say that many years ago, because it's becoming more true now than ever, given the gravity of the issues that we face, as humans on Earth. I would further say that globalization has been given the United States economy, our GDP, and our individual wealth, a huge shot in the arm. Our biggest partner in the world of globalization has been China. So the United States has been a beneficiary of trade, as imperfect as it is, as David pointed out, with all of its warts. This trade relationship has benefited our country tremendously. And there's no doubt that China has been an enormous beneficiary of our trade relationship as well. And as we've had more and more cultural exchanges and student exchanges, there have been millions of Chinese visitors to the United States. They all happily go home to China. There's, it's not like there's something restraining them from getting back into their home or their desire to go home. But the reality is that we've benefited tremendously from this bilateral relationship. And so the past, to me, is what we should look to kind of predicting the future. The future is going to be even better. And we've come into this kind of crazy time where China's rise is all of a sudden being recognized by politicians as a threat to the United States. And once we can get over the hurdle that China doesn't represent a threat of to our national security or to our economy or to our freedoms or to our basic way of life, then and through dialogue we'll establish better understanding and more cooperation. So I pledge to continue to work with David and our team at the Bush China Foundation to do whatever I can to help speak truth and shed light on this very, very important relationship in a way that hopefully will allow for greater collaborations across the board, not only on all these major issues, but on basic things that are taking place day to day. Our governments at all different levels should be having meetings to share and to better understand, to put ourselves in the other guy's shoes, and to create a better, more peaceful and harmonious world as a result.
Thank you very much, Neil. Yeah, David, please, your last word.
Well, Henry, thank you so much. And let me just conclude by saying, again, it's been an honor to be with you. And this is such a wonderful platform. And we're just grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. Um, you know, President George H.W. Bush brought incredible vision to the US-China relationship. And fundamentally, he asked himself a question about the relationship that was different than the kind of thing that we're seeing today. Today, political figures are sort of saying, where is the relationship going to be 15 minutes from now when I do my next tweet? And what President George H.W. Bush asked was, where do I want this relationship to be in the service of the interests of our nation 50 years from now and 100 years from now? And that farsightedness, that ability to kind of pay less attention to the headline of the moment and more attention to where this relationship could go over the long haul, that was a hallmark of President George H.W. Bush. And that's what we carry forward at the Bush-China Foundation, the notion that what's happening today is less important than where this relationship is ultimately going to be. And we fundamentally believe, as Neil has noted, and as we've said in this conversation, that the US-China relationship is the single most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. It matters to America. And of course, it matters to China as well. And we've got to get it right. And we have to think in terms of the long term, because the turbulence that we're seeing today will not always be with us. Yes, there will always be disagreements and differences in perspective on some pretty important issues, but the tonality shifts from time to time. The way that we think of different countries can shift based on what's happening in the world. And we're looking at the long-term interests of the United States. That's the angle that we're coming at this relationship from. The final thing I want to say, Henry, is I think we as Americans need to do a better job as a whole people and as a nation, in recognizing the validity and the truth of two statements at the same time. Number one, China is the most formidable competitor that the United States will ever have in the lifetimes of every American alive today. And the reverse of that is true as well. But it is also true that China is an indispensable partner to the United States, whether we like it or not. And America is an indispensable partner to China. We have a stake in each other's future, and we need to be able to work together with that in mind. And I think if we can recognize that there is truth to both of those ideas, and by the way, competition is not a bad thing. Competition is what has made the world what it is today. It's generated progress. It's generated the better mousetrap. It's generated technological innovation. So yes, we compete, but yes, we must also cooperate. We understand that at the Bush-China Foundation. And I couldn't be more privileged and honored than to have the opportunity to be Neil's partner in carrying forward the legacy of someone for whom I have extraordinary reverence and respect, President George H.W. Bush.
Thank you, David, for your really impressive remarks in the last conclusion. Yeah, I think that half century is really it's long, but also it's short. But I remember when I saw the photos when George H.W. Bush, president, was riding bicycle in Beijing. He was and Neil was such a young age. I'm a teenager then. Now we are all getting senior, getting old now. So what has happened in the last half century has really remarkable. China become, from the one of the poorest country now become one of the second largest economy. That's incredible. I think I agree with you. China-U.S. is indispensable from each other and really need each other. So how can we come together and continue our efforts to maintain such a relation? I think the Bush-China Foundation has done a remarkable job, and also CCG is also, we're trying to become a bridge between China and the outside world. So we hope that we'll continue our dialogue, we'll continue our discussion, but also we'll have those rational, have those reasonable, and also more human touch between our two countries. So Neil, that your father and your brother came to the Beijing Summer Olympics, and the hope that the Winter Olympics in the next February we'll have you come again for the Winter Olympics. We hope that we'll have those sports, people-to-people exchange, student exchange, tourism, and all the other program that can revive. We really, as David said, we cannot separate from each other. We have a huge bond, and let's continue the legacy of the both Bush president. So thank you so much, and thank you for our viewers, so many of them tonight, and also around the world. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.